The paper had been sewn into the lining so carefully that Naomi almost cut through it with her scissors before she felt the stiffness under the thread. She stopped, needle raised, and looked across the room to where Eli sat on the floor with the cat, pretending not to watch her the way he pretended most evenings, as if a boy of 8 could hide the fact that he was always watching. "There's something in your father's coat." She did not finish the thought aloud. She had already worked the seam open with the point of her scissors and drawn out a folded square of parchment, gone soft at the creases from handling. She did not read it. She had been raised not to read what was not given to her. But she held it to the lamp long enough to see a red wax seal, cracked but whole, and a hand of copperplate writing across the top that she recognized from every notice tacked to the courthouse door for the last 6 years, though she could not have said, in that moment, why her stomach dropped the way it did. Cy came in from the yard with his boots still on and saw the paper in her hand before she could fold it back. "That's nothing." He crossed the room in 4 strides and took it from her, gentle enough, and put it inside his shirt instead of the coat. "Old business. Doesn't concern you." Eli had stopped petting the cat. He watched his father's hand close around the paper, the way a boy watches a door being shut on a room he already knows the inside of, and he said nothing. And that silence, more than the seal or the writing, was the thing Naomi carried with her to bed that night. Naomi married Cy Hale on the 2nd Tuesday of March in front of the county clerk and nobody else, because Sheriff Prager himself had told her that the drifter sleeping in her uncle's empty stable would be run out of Custer County by the end of the month on a vagrancy charge if somebody did not give him a roof and a name to answer to. She had 31 years, a dead husband from the influenza, a laundry business that kept her fed and no more, and a plain conviction that a man ought not be jailed for the crime of having nothing. She had not married him for love. She had married him the way she might have taken in a lamed horse, because the alternative was worse, and she had room, barely, for one more mouth, and because she had watched the boy standing behind him at the jailhouse door, gripping a fistful of his father's coat, and had not been able to make herself walk away from that. She had not asked what he had done before he came to Broken Bow with nothing but the clothes on his back and a boy who called him Pa and would not say where they had come from. She had assumed, the way the whole town assumed, that there was a grief in it somewhere, a farm lost or a wife buried, and that a man carrying that kind of weight did not owe an accounting to a woman feeding him supper. She had asked once, on their wedding night, sitting at opposite ends of her small table, with the marriage lines still wet on the page between them, whether there was anything she ought to know. "Only that I'll work for my keep." Cy turned his hat once in his hands before he set it down. "And that the boy comes with me wherever I go." She had thought that was an answer. She had not known, then, that it was also a very careful kind of lie, the kind built entirely from things that happened to be true. The town had opinions about the marriage, and most of them reached her by way of the wash line, where women traded news the way men traded it at the feed store. Mrs. Prager thought it a kindness bordering on foolishness. The school teacher thought it brave. Naomi's own aunt, who had raised her after her mother died, came by the second week with a jar of chokecherry preserves and a great deal of unasked advice about men who arrived in a town with no history a body could check, and left an hour later without having convinced Naomi of anything except that the preserves were good and the advice was hers to ignore. Naomi had heard worse said about better matches. She hung her wash and let it pass over her the way weather passed, because a woman who had buried one husband already knew that the town's opinion of a marriage rarely had anything to do with how the marriage would actually be lived. The arrangement, once it settled into a shape, was plainer than either of them let on to the neighbors. Cy split her wood, mended her fence, and hauled her wash water without being asked twice, and in return he slept in the lean-to she had built onto the back of the house the summer her first husband died. And Eli slept on a pallet inside near the stove, close enough to the banked coals that Naomi checked on him twice, most nights out of a habit she could not explain to herself. She fed them both from a garden that had never before needed to stretch so far, and she let out the seams of two of her dead husband's old shirts for Eli, who was growing the way boys grow in spring, all at once and without warning. He rose before her most mornings, the coffee already on when she came out to the kitchen, and he never once let her carry the heavy end of anything, not the washtub. Not the feed sacks, not the fence posts he set two to a hole so the line would hold through winter frost heave. Cy worked harder than any hired man she had ever paid, and that was the first thing that troubled her, though she could not have said why it troubled her instead of pleasing her. He split more wood than the house could burn in a winter, stacking it in cords along the north wall the way a man builds against a siege rather than a season. He walked the fence line even on Sundays, checking wire that was not hers to check, studying the range that bordered her uncle's leased pasture with an attention that had nothing to do with a hired hand's obligations. Once she saw him standing at the top of the rise behind the house for the better part of an hour, hat off, looking north across land that belonged, by every deed the county clerk had on file, to a man named Cyrus Hale, who had not been seen in Custer County for the better part of 2 years and was widely believed, by those who thought of him at all, to be either dead in the Black Hills or too proud to come home to a wife's grave he had left standing alone in a field. She asked him once what he found so interesting up there. He told her the light was good for thinking, and nothing more, and she let it lie, because a wife who had married a stranger for charity's sake had already used up her right to press him twice in 1 week. There were smaller signs, too, easy enough to miss if she had not been the kind of woman who noticed how a man handled things. He knew how to read a brand at 100 paces and name the outfit it came from. He knew, without asking anyone, which of the county roads flooded first in a wet spring and which held. He carried himself into the mercantile like a man accustomed to being served rather than kept waiting, and caught himself at it and stepped back to let old Mr. Petzold finish with another customer first. A correction so quick that Naomi nearly missed it and did not quite forget it. Eli did not speak of his mother, and Naomi did not ask, but she noticed the second week that the boy had begun setting the table for 3 without being told, laying a fork at the place across from his father, as though the household had always held that shape, though she had eaten alone at that table for 2 years running. She noticed that he brought her the eggs from the coop before he brought them to Cy, small and warm in his cupped hands, offered up like something he had decided rather than something he had done by accident. She noticed on a wet Thursday that he had folded her one good shawl and set it on the dry side of the porch bench before the rain reached it, without being told the rain was coming, as though he had been watching the sky on her behalf the way some children watch it only for themselves. Most of all, she noticed the morning she carried a mended dress to the schoolhouse for the teacher and found the boy's slate propped against the window where the sun would dry the chalk. Under a row of sums in a child's careful, uneven letters that had clearly taken him a long while to get right were the words, "My mother Naomi Hale." He had not shown it to anyone. He had not shown it to her. She stood in the doorway with the mended dress still over her arm and did not go in, because, whatever this was, it did not belong to her to walk into uninvited, and she understood, the way a person understands weather before it arrives, that something in her chest had shifted and would not shift back to its old shape. There was a smaller thing before that, one she had almost let pass unnoticed. The Sunday after the wedding, Eli had dragged the good chair, the one that had belonged to her first husband, and had sat empty at the head of the table for 2 years because nobody in the house had felt entitled to fill it, around to the place across from her own. He had done it without asking, grunting with the effort of it, and had set it there so firmly, wedging the back leg against a knot in the floorboard that had stayed exactly where he put it through every meal that followed, through spring and into summer, until she stopped noticing it as a change and started noticing it only when, on the rare night he ate at his aunt's table in town instead, the chair sat empty and wrong. She said nothing to Cy about the slate, but that night, when Eli was asleep, she found herself watching her husband split kindling by lantern light with a kind of attention she had not spent on him before. He swung the axe easy and economical, every stroke landing in the same true line, and she thought, not for the first time, that a man did not learn an axe that way on a road with nothing behind him. A man learned it that way on land he meant to keep. The trouble that spring was ordinary trouble, the kind every household on the plains carried and few spoke of. Naomi's laundry income had thinned since 2 families moved east, and the winter feed bill for her uncle's cattle had come due before the calf money was in. She did not tell Cy the particulars, because a wife managing money quietly was no different from a wife managing anything else quietly, and she began skipping her own supper twice a week and calling it not being hungry, filling her plate light and pushing the rest toward the boy when she thought no one was watching. She had not hidden it from Eli. The boy began, without a word to anyone, leaving half his own plate untouched at supper and claiming he had eaten at the neighbor's, or that his stomach ached, or that he had filled up on bread earlier in the day. Naomi caught him at it twice before she understood what he was doing, watching how carefully he timed his excuses to match the nights her own portions shrank, and when she understood it, something in her broke a little. Quietly, the way ice breaks under weight it was never built to carry. Cy noticed the thinning before she meant him to. He said nothing about it directly, being a man who had learned that some doors were better opened from the side than head-on, but he began bringing in an extra rabbit from his snares most weeks and leaving it on the step without comment, and he took to walking the 4 miles to town himself on market days instead of asking her to spare the wagon so the mule's feed would stretch further. It was not enough to solve the debt. It was enough that she understood he had seen what she had tried to hide and had chosen to answer it with his hands instead of his questions, which was, she was beginning to learn. The only language the man seemed to trust. It was Cy who fixed the actual trouble, and he fixed it the way he did most things, without asking permission and without explaining himself afterward. Old Prager's mare came down with colic in the middle of a cold snap, thrashing and sweating in her stall, with nobody in town willing to sit up with an animal that looked past saving. It was Naomi who walked into that stable at dusk with her grandmother's linseed oil bottle in her coat pocket and stayed there until dawn. She knew to keep the mare moving and off her back, to drench her slow so she would not choke, to press an ear low against the belly and listen for the sounds that meant the gut had woken up again. She talked to the animal low and steady through the worst hours, the way her grandmother had taught her to talk to anything in pain, checking the mare's gum color by lantern light and pressing 2 fingers to the pulse under her jaw the way a person checks a fever in a child, and near first light the gut sounds came back and the danger passed. Prager paid her the $2 he had promised. 3 days later, without any word of it beforehand, he forgave the balance still owed on the pasture lease her uncle had been carrying since Christmas, a debt that had been hanging over the household without Cy ever knowing its size. Naomi had not asked to be paid in favors. She had gone to save a suffering animal because she knew how, and the fact that it had also solved something she had been carrying alone left her strange and unsteady for days afterward, as though she had been caught doing something private in public. She had grown up believing a woman's usefulness was measured out quietly, in laundry taken in and meals stretched thin. Never in anything so plain as walking into a neighbor's barn and setting a crisis right with her own 2 hands, while half the men in town stood outside deciding the mare was past saving. Cy watched her walk that mare through the dark from the porch, a blanket around his shoulders and Eli asleep against his side, and said nothing about it for a long while. When he finally spoke, it was only to tell her that she had a doctor's hands, and that he had not known that about her, and that there seemed to be a great deal about her he had not known. She might have said the same to him. She did not, yet word of the mare traveled the way news travels in a small county, faster and larger than the thing that caused it. And within a fortnight 2 more households had sent for Naomi rather than for the veterinarian in Sargent, who charged more and knew less about the plain sicknesses than a woman who had grown up nursing them. She set a boy's dislocated shoulder at the schoolhouse with nothing but her own 2 hands and a memory of her grandmother doing the same, and treated a case of milk fever in a neighbor's cow that would otherwise have gone down for good. Cy watched all of it from whatever distance the work required, saying little, though she caught him once telling Eli, in a voice he had not meant her to hear, that his wife's hands could do more good in an afternoon than most men managed in a season. The man from the land office arrived on a Thursday in a hired buggy with a clerk's ledger under his arm and a letter from an Omaha banking concern that had been trying for 2 years to settle the estate of a landowner presumed lost. His name was Aldous Whitfield, and he had come to post notice, as the law required, that the Hale Range, some 40,000 acres running clear across 3/4 of the county, would be surveyed for sale at the courthouse within the month unless the owner of record, or a legitimate heir, came forward to claim it. He stopped at Naomi's gate because it was the nearest house to the range line, and because Prager had mentioned, over supper, that a hired hand named Cy had been seen walking that fence line more than any wage would explain. Naomi stood in her own dooryard and listened to a stranger describe her husband's land in acres and dollars, while her husband stood 10 feet away with his hat in his hands and said not one word to correct him. Whitfield went on at some length, the way men do when they believe themselves the only ones in a conversation with anything worth saying, describing the range in terms of water rights and grazing capacity and the interest the estate had already drawn from 2 cattle syndicates out of Kearney, none of it addressed to Cy at all, since a hired hand had no reason to care where 40,000 acres landed. You'd know him if you saw him. Whitfield consulted his ledger without looking up. Tall, dark-headed. There's a photograph taken at his wedding some years back that the bank still keeps on file. Cyrus Hale. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Naomi turned to look at her husband directly and found him already looking at her and understood, in the space between one breath and the next, exactly what she was looking at. She did not accuse him in front of the stranger. She untied her apron with hands that did not shake, though she would remember afterward being surprised that they didn't, and told Mr. Whitfield he was welcome to water his horse before he continued on. Then she went inside and shut the door and stood with her back against it for a length of time she could not afterward account for. Eli found her there. He did not ask what was wrong, because he already knew and had known for longer than she had. He was going to tell you. The boy stood in the doorway to the back room, still in his stocking feet. He told me he was going to tell you before summer. He just kept saying it wasn't time. Why didn't you tell me? He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything, chewing the inside of his cheek the way he did over his sums. Because you liked him for nothing. My mother married him for the land, at the end, when she was sick and scared and needed somebody to keep it safe for me. I didn't want you to be like that. I wanted somebody to like him for nothing, just once, before he had to be Mr. Hale again. He went to the chest at the foot of his pallet and took out the same folded parchment Naomi had found sewn into the coat months before, and this time he did not ask permission before he opened it and set it flat on the table under the lamp. It was the deed, dated 6 years back, to the whole of the Hale Range, north and south sections both. 40,000 acres carrying the name of a man his son had loved enough to bury for 2 years under a hired hand's shirt. You should have this. He smoothed the crease with the flat of his hand the way he had seen his father do it. So you know he isn't lying anymore. He was 8 years old, and he had just handed a stranger's fortune across a kitchen table because he had decided, on his own accounting, that a woman who set a plate for 3 without being asked deserved to know the truth more than his father deserved to keep hiding from it. His hands were shaking a little by the time he stepped back from the table, though his chin never dropped, and Naomi understood that the shaking was not fear of his father. It was the plain effort of a small boy doing a hard right thing without anyone there to tell him it was allowed. Sai came in from the yard in time to see the deed lying open under the lamp and his son standing beside it with his chin up, daring his father to be angry. Sai was not angry. He crossed the room the way he had crossed it for the coat, 4 strides, gentle enough, and put his hand flat on the paper for a moment, not to take it back this time, only to feel it there, under his palm. 2 years ago my wife died asking me whether I loved this land or loved her. He did not look up from the paper while he said it. I told her both, and it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, because by then I couldn't have told you which I'd have chosen if it came to it. I buried her on a rise that cost more defense than most men make in a year, and I found I couldn't stand on hale ground another day without hearing that question. So I left it standing and took my boy and walked until nobody knew my name, and I told myself I'd only go back to being Cyrus Hale when I found somebody who wanted the man and not the 40,000 acres attached to him. He looked at Naomi. Not at the deed. I found her walking a sick mare through the dark for $2 she needed worse than I did, and I still didn't have the nerve to tell her the truth, because I was afraid that once she knew, I'd never again be sure which one she'd have chosen. Naomi did not answer him with words at first. She looked at the deed on her table, at the son who had taken the risk his father would not, and at the man who had let himself be poor for 2 years rather than risk being loved for the wrong reason, and she understood that the anger she had expected to feel had already burned down to something steadier underneath it. I chose you Tuesday before last, signing my name next to a man I believed owned nothing but a boy and a coat. She folded the deed closed herself, gently, and set it back in his hands. If you think 40,000 acres changes what I signed, you never understood what I was signing for. They rode into the county seat together 3 days later, all 3 of them in the wagon, and Cyrus Hale stood in front of the recorder's desk in his good coat, the real one, kept folded at the bottom of a trunk for 2 years for exactly no occasion he had let himself imagine. He had the clerk strike out the notice of sale and enter, beneath his own restored name, a second name on the deed of record, so that the Hale range from that day carried both Cyrus and Naomi Hale as owners in equal standing, a thing no banker or land agent could undo with a survey or a letter from Omaha. He did it without a speech. He signed his own name, then hers, then handed her the pen so she could watch the ink dry on it herself. Because he had learned, in 2 years of being nobody, that some things a man ought to let a woman witness rather than simply tell her about afterward. Aldous Whitfield closed his ledger without another word and drove back to Omaha with nothing to report but a marriage. The 2 cattle syndicates out of Kearney would have to find their 40,000 acres somewhere else, and the notice tacked to the courthouse door came down by the end of the week, replaced by nothing more remarkable than an announcement of the county fair. That spring, when the calves came, Eli rode the fence line beside his father the way he had watched him ride it alone for a year, close enough now that he no longer had to imagine what his father was looking for out there. The good chair stayed at its place across from her own straight through summer, and into fall the knot in the floorboard worn a little smoother where its leg had rubbed against it, and nobody in the house ever moved it again. Naomi walked out most evenings to meet her men at the gate with the lamp already lit in the window behind her, the way she had lit it every night since the wedding, before she had known there was a county's worth of reason to bother. She had married a man to keep him off the streets. She kept him, in the end, for reasons that had never once had anything to do with what he owned. And on the evening the recorder's ink was still drying on her own name beside his, she found she did not need to say so out loud for either of her men to already know it. Eli set the table for 3 that night the way he had set it every night since March, and for the first time since he had learned to write his letters, he did not need to guess at whether the name belonged there.